All right. Well, hi, everybody. Good to see everyone. Want to offer a quick correction. So on Sunday, I said that I'd seen an article, and the headline said that the Willis Community Center was the second busiest polling place in the country. And then someone very graciously pointed out to me that it was the second busiest in the county. That one R made a big difference. I'm sure there's probably an illustration in there about reading closely when we study the scriptures or something like that. But anyway, basically, I'm a big old doofus and can't read. Yeah. Also, that shows you that I didn't read the article. I just read the headline, which is something that we all do. Anytime anyone ever tells you, well, I read an article that says this, what they mean is I saw a headline of an article on Facebook and I didn't actually click on it. That's really what everyone means, right? So we are going to jump right in tonight. Man, I'm super excited. First of all, tomorrow night is trunk or treat. Whoop, whoop. So here's the deal. We have been kind of watching the weather. I hate whenever it's going to rain. I can't. Every time you plan something outside, it rains, and then if you cancel it, it doesn't rain, just without fail. It always happens. And so we've been watching the weather, and we have a little bit of a rain in the forecast earlier in the day, but it looks like by tomorrow evening it should be pretty well cleared out. So for right now, unless something totally changes and it just starts, pouring down, we are planning on being outside just like normal. If we have to move out of the rain, we have plan B, which is we're just going to come inside, and everybody who comes to trunk or treat is going to get a little tour of the church building, right? And seriously, we're going to put an arrow on the floor right here, and you're going to come in this door, and we're just going to have arrows on the ground saying, go this way, and they're going to get a free little tour of First Baptist Willis. Most of the time, when I'm giving someone a tour, it's whenever the alarm goes off at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I got to meet a police officer, and I get to give him a tour of the building. Oh, this is our children's area, this is our youth area, right? While we look for intruders. Brother Charles did leave me a bat. There's a bat behind the door of my office, and many of you have probably seen it before if you've ever been in there. There's a bat, and Brother Charles, it was back there, and he told me, I'm leaving this, so whoever's in this office next, they can use it. And one day Adam came in last summer, and he reaches behind the door, and he just gets the bat, and I go, everything okay, man? And he goes, there's something in one of those containers out in the woods. I said, is it a person or an animal? He said, I don't know. That's why I came to get this bat, because either way, I figured I might need it. And it turns out it was a mother buzzard, which who even knew that? I guess I'd never thought about little baby buzzards hatching out of eggs. I guess I should have known that that's how that happened. I just never thought about it. And there was a buzzard nest in one of those containers, and for about the rest of last summer, she was just out there. And anytime you tried to go out there, she was not happy about it. Anyway, we are going to be continuing to go through church history. And I'm really excited because, for starters, I'm just a giant history buff. Many of you know this if you've hung out with me very much. We are talking today about the period of time called the Middle Ages. Now, can you guess why we call it the Middle Ages? Because they're in the middle. These ages, right? I know, it's a real creative name we came up with, right? These are sometimes called the Dark Ages. You ever heard that before? Or if you're really fancy, you call it the medieval period, right? So we're going to talk about this. Now, I want to go ahead and warn you, the period of history we're talking about today is about 1,000 years long. So we're doing like a real, just very broad kind of, here's the basics of the big things that happened, okay? This is my absolute favorite period of history. I think part of the reason why I wanted to study history because I love like knights and castles and junk like that, right? In here, I'm exactly the same as when I was 9. I like all the same stuff, right? And so, does anyone else feel this way? No, nobody? Okay, just me? All right, cool. So we're talking about the Middle Ages. I love the Middle Ages, but specifically, we're talking about what happened in the history of the church during this time period. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff. So last week, we talked about the early years, the first about 500-ish years of church history. And that's the time that we call like the church fathers, right? And that was like they were kind of figuring out like, what do we believe? And then people would say crazy things like Jesus didn't really have a body or something like that. And they would have to go, yeah, we don't believe that. Remember Santa Claus punched that guy in the face because he said Jesus wasn't God? Right? Classic, great story, right? So, up until this point in church history, now this is going to sound a little weird, okay? But up until this point of church history, everyone was Catholic. Technically, you and I are Catholic. I don't want to freak anybody out, okay? Catholic, the word Catholic means universal. So the Catholic Church is the universal church. It's all Christians everywhere. Today, we're going to learn about how we got the split, the first major split in the church family tree, and then we wound up with Roman Catholic, like what we all think of when we hear the word Catholic, right? So we'll get to that. All of it really starts with the fall of Rome, the year 476, okay? Middle Ages refers to about 1,000 years, basically between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, right? Covering a lot of ground, barely scratching the surface. But the fall of Rome, Constantine, the emperor of Rome, who declared Christianity the official religion of the empire, he moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to a town called Constantinople. He named it after himself, right? It's still around today. It's called Istanbul today. It's in Turkey, right? Which, when I was a kid and I found out there was a real country named Turkey, that was just the funniest thing I could ever even imagine. And then I found out there's another country called Djibouti. And that became the new funniest country name in the world, right? Yeah, if you don't believe me, go look it up. It's on the east coast of Africa, Djibouti. It starts with a D. So, Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. So basically what happened was we had two major cities that were kind of like the centers of the empire. You had Rome, like the old capital, and then you had the new capital. And everybody who was cool moved east to the eastern capital, to Constantinople. And what happened was, all of a sudden, we basically had kind of two halves of the Roman Empire. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but it's going to be a big deal to church history, right? Basically, I have two empires now. The Western Roman Empire, all of the people in charge, all of the army, all of them, they all went east. And now, all of a sudden, the western half of the empire is wide open to anybody who wants to come in and start trouble. And you know who they were surrounded by? All to the north of them in places like Germany and France and England? Barbarians, right? Think Vikings, okay? But, well, they did have pointy hats, but not as pointy, okay? The barbarians, basically Vikings from the north, France, England, Germany, places like that. And this is why they're called barbarians. You ready? The word barbarian comes from the Greek word barbaros, which means to babble. It's what you call someone whose language you can't understand. It probably originally was an insult, like, you know, those people who are just ba, 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 right? So they called them barbarians because they babbled. You couldn't understand what they were saying. But these guys also had big, great, bushy beards. And so the word barbarian got associated with these crazy, wild, bearded, wild men, right? Yeah, I see you stroking the beard there, right? Because of this, the word barbarian became associated with beards. That's why you go to the barber to get your hair cut. True story. Okay, you ready? You want a quick commercial that has nothing to do with church history? Do you know why barber poles have the red stripe down the pole? Because in the Middle Ages, the only guy in town who had anything sharp enough to do minor surgery was the barber. Barbers followed armies into battle, and they performed like battlefield surgery, field surgery, after battles. If you needed a tooth pulled or anything, if you needed any kind of like minor surgery, the barber was the guy in town to go see. And he would hang his tools up on the post outside, and blood would run down, and there would be this red streak on the poles. And everybody knew if there was a building and it had a big red pole out front covered in blood, well, that was the barber. That's the guy you're looking for. Then when it moved to America, of course, what did we have to add to it? A blue stripe for red, white, and blue, obviously, right? America, what up? So that's the story of barbers. Doesn't really have to do with anything, but here we go. Bunch of different tribes all attack Rome for about 100 years. Every once in a while, there's just new people popping up. Here are some of their names. The Goths. Not what we think of when we think of Goths, right? When I was in high school, they're like kids they painted their fingernails black and they wore eyeliner and they spiked their hair up and listened to like weird death metal music. And we called them goths. They were gothic, right? Well, that is a reference to these guys, the Goths. And then there were the Visigoths. And then probably there were the Gauls, the Huns. You ever heard of Attila the Hun? Attila the Hun, one of the most fearsome barbarians in history. Do you know how he died? He got a nosebleed and choked on his own blood and died. There was probably a decent amount of alcohol involved in that story also, by the way, right? But yeah, that's a true story. And the most famous one that you all know about, whether you know it or not, was a tribe of barbarians who were famous for when they would come into a Roman city, not only would they come in and fight them, but then they would just destroy everything in sight. Like, just everything. You know what they were called? Vandals. That's where the term vandalism comes from, right? So these are the people we're dealing with. And they're just coming in and just causing trouble. And here's what's most important. These people are most definitely not Christians, okay? Like, not even a little bit. So what do you do with all these wild people? I mean, most of the Roman Empire at this point is largely Christian. I mean, the majority of the people who live in that part of the world are Christians. And these guys are coming in. Can they even follow Jesus? I mean, how do you share the good news with somebody who came into your town and killed everybody and burned all the buildings down? Doesn't seem like the kind of people you want to go like send missionaries to, right? Remember the story of Jonah? When God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh? You know why Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh, right? Because the Ninevites had brutally attacked the Israelites like a generation before that. And God says, go to Nineveh and tell them to repent or I'm going to destroy them. And Jonah goes, oh, I don't go and you destroy them? Great, I'll just not go then. Forget those guys. I hate those guys. You know, we read the story of Jonah and we say like, you know, if God tells you to do something, don't run away. And that is an important lesson to take from the book of Jonah. But the real purpose of the story of Jonah is God loves the people who you hate. You know, if you read the second half of Jonah, the part that doesn't make it into the kid's story, Jonah goes and preaches and tells the people to repent or God will destroy them. And the people do repent. And Jonah's mad at God for saving them. Jonah says, I knew you were going to do this. This is why I didn't want to come here. Because I know that you are loving and merciful and that you would forgive them. And he throws a little temper tantrum. I mean, it's kind of crazy. And so we got all these barbarians. What about all the Christians and all the churches and the places that are now ruled by these Viking warlord guys? What happens to them? Well, for a couple hundred years, it was basically just chaos. I mean, it was the Wild West. And all the people in charge, all the military and the rulers, they had moved 1,000 miles away. And they didn't live here anymore. So, here's what happened. On Christmas Day, in the year 800, this guy right here, his name is Charlemagne. Charlemagne is French for Charles the Magnificent, right? Charlemagne, on Christmas Day, in the year 800, is kneeling down in prayer. And the Pope from Rome comes up behind him and places a crown on his head. Now, it wasn't like a total surprise. I mean, they had worked this all out. They had planned it. It wasn't like he just went, oh, what, cool hat, okay? But he puts a crown on his head, and he says that Charlemagne, even though he lives in Germany, he's a German king, Charlemagne has been given the title as the Holy Roman Emperor. His new title is Holy Roman Emperor. And essentially, the Pope basically said, well, if the emperor moved away, we're just going to make our own kingdom, and we're going to have a new king. And Charlemagne, you're a good Christian French king, our German king. You can be our new guy. This kind of reestablished the old Western Roman Empire. And it reunited, for the first time in several hundred years, it reunited the church and the government. Do you remember who was the first guy who put them together? From last week. Constantine, yeah, exactly. And so what happened was they create this new kingdom. Well, here's the problem with the Holy Roman Empire. It was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. It was none of those things, right? It was basically just this like ceremonial thing. Okay, so this is kind of where we are. This is setting the scene, okay? The world has changed. There's no more Roman Empire, no more Western Roman Empire. And all of a sudden, we got all these wild people and all these Christians going, okay, well, I guess we need to go share the gospel. And so, this is what we call the period of the missionaries. Missionaries going, we feel really strongly that we've got to share the gospel with these lost barbarians. Or some of the barbarians would get saved. They would hear the gospel and they would be saved, and they would share it with their friends and their families and the people they lived with. And what happens is the church begins kind of gaining ground in the north, in places like France and Spain and Germany and England, places like that. So many people are getting saved. The most famous missionary from this period is this guy right here. That's St. Patrick. St. Patrick was a missionary to Ireland in the mid-400s. He was a real guy. A few things about St. Patrick. He was an early missionary to Ireland. Ireland was considered like the edge of the world. I mean, it was a scary place. People did not want to go there, okay? Now it's kind of hard to imagine that because now it's all just like leprechauns and Lucky Charms, and like we don't think about it as being this crazy wild place, but back then it was. Patrick was a British Roman citizen living in like modern-day England, and at the age of 16, he was captured by Irish pirates and sold into slavery. And he lived as a slave in Ireland for 6 years. And after 6 years, he escaped and ran away and went back home. And many years later, he became a believer and felt very strongly God calling him to go back to Ireland to share the gospel with these wild people in this crazy island out in the middle of nowhere. And so that's our guy, St. Patrick. He did a lot of interesting things. One of the things he did was he took the shamrock, and he used it to teach people about the Trinity. That was 3 in 1, right? And it kind of became like a symbol of Irish Christianity. There's also this story that he drove all the snakes out of Ireland. That didn't happen. Someone made that up like 1,000 years later. That's just a total legend, right? Kind of like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. That didn't really happen, right? Yeah, that didn't really happen. First of all, that was made up like way after George Washington. Some other guy who was like writing a biography about him just made that story up. Also, Betsy Ross, she didn't sew nothing. First American flag, Betsy Ross, that did not happen. Her great-grandchildren wanted to turn her house into a museum, and they just straight up made up that story. Now, it is true that she sewed American flags, but the story that she sewed the very first American flag is just a complete lie, right? Also, everything you think you know about Thanksgiving is wrong, but we're going to get to that in a few weeks, right? There were no buckles on anybody's hats, okay? Complete historical inaccuracy. So, this starts happening. The missionaries start going north into these like wild barbarian cultures and sharing the gospel. And they're gaining ground. However, at the same time, in that same time period, the church began losing ground. So let me ask you this. What part of the world was Jesus from? Yeah, the Middle East. And when you think of the Middle East today, you don't think of that as like predominantly Christian territory, do you? What religion do we associate that part of the world with? Why? Yeah, because that's who lives there now, and they have since about the 600s. So this is when we see the rise of Islam. Begins in the Arabian Peninsula in the year 610. That's Muhammad. And basically, we've talked about Islam a little bit, so I won't go too much into it, but Muhammad went to a cave, and while he was in the cave, he was attacked by what he said was a demon. Grabbed him by the throat, threw him on the ground, told him to worship him. He went home and told his wife, and his wife's cousin convinced him that it was actually an angel sent from God, and that it was teaching him a new way to follow God. And so we have the beginning of Islam. It started off very peacefully, but a bunch of stuff went down. We don't have time to get into it. But basically, after about 10 years, he decided this whole peaceful thing isn't really working out. So he put an army together, and they would show up at your town, and they would say, hey, you got 2 choices. You can all be Muslims, or we'll come in and kill everybody. You get to pick, though. So what it'll be. So, yeah, very violent conquest. I mean, extremely violent. There's this thing going around that you hear all the time, especially post 9/11. This was very popular. Islam. It's a religion of peace. It's literally was founded by a warlord. That's him. And what happened was this led to all this land that was traditionally Christian land since the time of Jesus, places like Egypt, the Middle East, North Africa, stuff like that, had been predominantly Christian ever since the time of Jesus, all of a sudden was mostly Muslim. Now, this didn't happen overnight. It took a long time, right? But here's what you need to know. No Christians, up until this point in history, no Christians had ever converted people through the threat of violence. I mean, it's just a very different approach. So the Holy Land falls to Muslim control, especially the city of Jerusalem. It's a big deal. And I want to say this. We've talked about Islam before, so we're not going to spend too much time on it, but I do believe that Islam is probably the single greatest victory that the enemy has ever scored in the history of the world. Because there's just enough in it that's true that it convinces people. I mean, it's talking about the same God that they say that it's the same God that Abraham heard from. Now, obviously, we don't think that, right? But here's what happened. This map here. So it starts in the dark orange area, like kind of reddish orange. That's where it began. And then the arrows are where the armies actually went. So the yellow part is what they took over next. And then the green part. See how it goes all the way into Spain? Now, when you think of Spain, you don't usually think like Muslim, right? But all they had to do was cross that little stretch of water right there. And the purple was predominantly Christian. Now, there are still Christians living in the other areas. It's not like everyone there is a Muslim. There are still Christians there today. Lots of Christians. But not most of the people who live there. So, this is kind of the scene, right? Gaining ground in the north, pushing past all those purple areas to share the gospel with the Vikings, and losing ground in the east. Then, here's what happens next. The Great Schism. Schism is not a word we use a whole lot. It just means like a division, a split, right? Has anyone ever had a schism with somebody? Next time you know someone who breaks up with someone, you say, "We have suffered a great schism," right? So we talked about this a minute ago, but the word Catholic just means universal. So up until this point in history, every Christian in the world was Catholic. The Catholic Church just meant the whole church, the universal church, right? But this right here, what we're about to talk about, is the first example of a major split in church history. Now, there had been a few groups that had split off in the early days, but they mostly kind of died out, or they sort of it was just a small group of people that carried it on. This is the first major divide in the family tree, okay? So, remember how I told you we had Rome and Constantinople, the east and the west, and it basically divided the empire into basically two empires? Well, what's going to happen is the church is going to split east and west as well, okay? So we have Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is still around today, and then in the west we have Roman Catholic Christianity, which is still around today too, yes. Now, later on, we're going to get to this next week, later on the Roman Catholic split and we had Catholic and Protestant, and we're Protestant, right? But that's next week, okay? For about 500 years after the capitals moved, the two worlds just kept kind of drifting apart, right? It's kind of like when you work with someone and you're really good friends, and then you or they go get a job somewhere else, and you still really like them, but you just don't see each other as much anymore. You're not hanging out, you know? I always say this, when you were a kid at school, the only reason you hung out with those kids was because you were trapped in a building with them 5 days a week. You're all the same age and you live in a circle we drew around the school building. That's it. That's the only reason you're all stuck together in this weird little social experiment called school, right? And then after you graduate, you realize, oh, I didn't actually like most of those people. Otherwise, I'd be hanging out with them still. You know? And it turns out if you're not forced to hang out with them 5 days a week, you're not going to hang out with them. Sort of the same thing. East and West continue to drift apart. And eventually they split into two distinct churches, the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic in the West. This is the Great Schism. It happened in the year 1054, right? So what were they arguing about? Well, a couple things. Number one, who's the boss? Well, in the West, who's the boss of the Roman Catholic Church? The Pope, the guy with the big hat, right? In the East, it was this guy called the Patriarch. The Patriarch was like, what's interesting about this is both of those words mean father, right? So it was like the church dad. Okay, so you got the Pope versus the Patriarch. Now the Pope in Rome claimed to have direct authority directly from Jesus via the Apostle Peter. This is what's called apostolic succession. So here's what happened. In Matthew chapter 16, we're just going to read it. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus talks to Peter, and they say that this is the story of Jesus telling Peter that he was in charge. After Jesus left, Peter was the next guy up, and then Peter went to Rome, and so the next guy after him, and after him, after him, after him, all the way down to the Pope today. And so it's this direct, unbroken line from today's Pope all the way back to Jesus himself. So let's read what Jesus said to Peter, and you can decide if you think that's what Jesus is saying, okay? Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. It says, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Simon Peter replied, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.'" So this is the story of Jesus telling Peter that he was going to have this authority. He says, "Who do people say I am?" And they say, "Well, some people say you're John the Baptist, some people say you're one of the prophets, some people say you're Elijah." And Jesus says, "Yeah, but who do you say that I am?" And Peter, who very rarely gets the answer right. I mean, you read the story of Peter, it's just one thing after another of him just sticking his foot in his mouth, right? I mean, it's not great. In fact, sometimes he says real dumb stuff. You know, like the story where they're up on the mountain and they see Jesus transformed. You know what Peter says, right? He says, "Jesus, it is good that we are here. I'm going to make tents for everybody and we'll just stay here." Okay? Whenever they see Jesus on the beach, they're out fishing and they see Jesus after he's resurrected. And they look and they say, "Is that Jesus?" And you know what Peter does, right? He jumps out of the boat and tries to outswim the boat to the beach. This is the second time Peter has jumped out of a boat to go see Jesus. He's kind of impulsive. He just, one thing about Peter, you never have to wonder what the guy's thinking. Just whatever he thinks in his head comes out of his mouth. And he just does stuff. He's kind of impulsive. Remember that time he tried to kill a dude? And he cut the guy's ear off instead? You think he was aiming for the guy's ear? No, he was trying to cut that guy's head off. Because he's a hothead. He was trying to straight up decapitate a dude. And Jesus says, "Hey, everyone put your swords away." And he puts the ear back on the guy and says, "Everybody calm down." It's a great story. And so Peter gets a rare opportunity to get the answer right. Right? He says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of John. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter." His name is Simon, but Jesus calls him Peter, which means rock. He calls him Rocky. It's a nickname. He says, "You're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." So they say, well, there you go. Jesus gave the authority to Peter. Peter came to Rome, and he passed that authority on to the next guy, the next pope. Peter was the first pope, is what they say. And it came all the way down to the pope today. And therefore, whatever the pope says, we have to listen to because he has the authority directly from Jesus. Right? What do we think about that? I know we have some ex-Catholics here who may have strong opinions, right? Here's my, point of disagreement with our Catholic brothers, right? When Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church," what's the rock? Is it Peter, or is it the confession that Peter gave? Yeah, this is called the good confession, right? Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, that right there is the foundation of my kingdom. My church will be built on that. On what? On the gospel. Yeah, the good news that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the bedrock. That's the foundation. That's the cornerstone of our faith. It's the gospel, not some guy. Well, yeah, they like that. I mean, look, if you believed that you had this authority directly from Jesus, you would take that really seriously. And so it's not like it doesn't make sense. I mean, if you believe that first thing, that Jesus gave the authority to Peter and he brought it to Rome, then everything after that makes perfect sense. The problem is I just don't agree with that first part. You know what I'm saying? So that was the first big argument. Who's in charge? Well, there were church fathers all over the place, and the guy in Constantinople was kind of the main guy, and the guy in Rome said that he should be the main guy. And how well do you think that worked out? No. So the guy in the east and the guy in the west have this big argument about who should really be the guy everyone needs to listen to, right? No, that was just why the guy in the west in Rome, the Pope in Rome, thought he should be the one that everyone should listen to. This is just one of the things. So what else did they disagree about? Next one is kind of how they approach everything. In the West, they're all about books. They're all about study. They're all about let's get down in the nitty-gritty and dissect the words and the sentence structure and all that stuff. And in the East, they're all about vibes, man. You come to church to experience God. You don't come to church to dissect God, right? This is a big thing. And I know that it's weird to think about what I'm about to say is going to sound a little weird. But when you think about like Eastern philosophies, it's all a little like woo-woo, right? Technically, Christianity is an Eastern religion. Jesus was from the Middle East. And he got the gospel got brought to Rome, where they were all about like counting coins and writing laws. You know what I mean? And so there's like a little bit of a culture clash here. And so in the West, they're all about scholarship. And in the East, they're all about like experiencing God. They have these big debates about exactly how the Trinity works. And if you want to really dive into it, there's this thing called the Philokae controversy. And we're not going to get into it tonight. But in the West, they're all about books and debates and being logical. In the East, it's about mystery and experiential vibes. So this is the kind of things they're disagreeing about. So how did they actually break up? This is hilarious. Are you ready? In 1054, both the Pope and the Patriarch both excommunicated each other in a series of letters. So I think the Pope in Rome started it, right? And he kicked out the Patriarch, so then he kicked him back out. And so they excommunicated each other, and they both referred to each other as the anti-pope. Right? The anti-pope. Their names were Pope Leo and Patriarch Michael, which you did not think Michael was going to be one of the names, did you? You thought it was going to be something super weird. No, it's just Mike. Mike and Leo. They call each other the anti-pope, and so now all of a sudden that means that now every Christian in the world is either Eastern or Western. Now, the Eastern Orthodox Church is still around today. If you go to a church in somewhere like Greece or Russia or in the Middle East, it's going to be a very different vibe to how we do church. Just way different. There are Eastern Orthodox churches here. There's one over on 242. I see it every time I go to the fish store. It's like a Syrian Orthodox church. I've never been there, right? But I see it every time I go to the fish store, right? My fish store is on 242. Used to be called Fish R Us, but they're under new management, in case anybody's wondering. Right? Yes, sir? So most of that is like old school Christianity. I'll repeat the question is, where does all the ritual, even Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, they both have all these rituals that are kind of foreign to us, right? That's not really how we do church. Most of that is just really, really old, ancient Christianity practices. In fact, if you went to an Eastern Orthodox church today, the way they're doing Sunday morning church is pretty much identical to the way they were doing Sunday morning church in the year 100. I mean, it's basically the same thing. Yeah, when I said the vibes thing, I'm being a little facetious. So one of the things that they're really big on is these icons. We're going to talk about it here in a little bit, but the icons, they believe that when you have a picture of Jesus, that actual image, one of the other things they argued about was in the East, the pictures all look a little weird. They got weird faces, and their eyes aren't the same size, and all that's on purpose. It's not like they didn't know how to draw people. They want it to be a little off because they think they have this idea that when you look at that image, it's like a portal into heaven, and you're you should be seeing something otherworldly because it's supposed to draw your mind to the realm of the heavens, right? And in the West, they wanted their pictures to be hyper-realistic because don't nobody here know how to read, and looking at windows at church is the closest they're ever going to come to reading the Bible. And in the East, they said, well, that's breaking one of the 10 Commandments. That's a graven image. And they said, you literally worship your pictures. And this is the kind of stuff they're arguing about, right? And this has been going on for hundreds of years until they finally just split up, right? And this is where we get the first two major branches of the church family tree. Eastern Orthodox and Western Roman Catholicism, right? So, any other questions about that before we move on to the next thing? Right back there, Toby. One second, Toby's coming. Raise your hand again, bud. Go, Toby, go, 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 go. We'll see how those conditioning in football have been working out.
So what's the basis of the argument of why the patriarch thought he was in charge?
Okay.
We know why the Pope thought he was in charge.
Good question. So we know why the Pope thinks. So technically there were 5 major kind of 5 cities that were sort of the major hubs of Christianity. So you had Rome, Constantinople, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And there were there was a guy at each one. And so essentially, the guy in Rome said, I'm in charge, everyone else listen to me. And the other 4 guys said, forget that guy. That's a really simplified version of it, right? In fact, I have a map that will demonstrate that very thing. Ba-ba! Right? So Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople. Those are kind of the eastern centers of the church. And then Rome is doing its own thing. And the guy in Rome is well, you guys should be doing what we do. Because, I got put here by Jesus. So you all need to listen to me. And they all went, yeah, we're not listening to you, bro. Well, most of the people who lived in the purple area thought that the people in the pink area were all a bunch of weirdos who didn't do church right. You know what I mean? Of course we look at the picture and we can see God. Everybody knows that. And the people in the pink area are going, well, of course Jesus gave authority to Rome. Everybody knows that. And so, yeah, it was kind of now, in the middle there, you see it's a little fuzzy, right? It's not like everybody was on board. And people argued about this. Whole books were written about this. It was a whole thing. All right, we got to go a little bit quicker now. So let's talk briefly about the Crusades. So all that territory that was lost to the Muslims, right? During the Middle Ages, the Pope, after they split up, after the Great Schism, the Pope decided, you know what? We need to go take back the Holy Land from these Muslims. So the First Crusade was in 1066. They basically they raised up armies of Christians and sent armies of Christians that gave her swords and armor and said, go kill some Muslims. Real Christ-like, right? Sent them down there. They reconquered Jerusalem, and they founded the Kingdom of Jerusalem. There was a king of Jerusalem. There were several kings of Jerusalem. And so the First Crusade, by all accounts, was a huge success. They took back Jerusalem, and they founded a Christian kingdom in the middle of Muslim territory. Well, how do you think all the Muslims who lived there felt about that? And so they fought back. So then we had to send a second crusade to go fight against all these angry Muslims. Now, they send the second crusade, and they lost Jerusalem. A guy named Balian actually surrendered Jerusalem after a long siege in 1187, surrendered Jerusalem to the Muslim ruler, Saladin. Right? There's a fantastic movie about the Second Crusade called Kingdom of Heaven. If you've never seen it, it's great. It's from Ridley Scott, the same guy who made Gladiator. So, and Gladiator 2 is coming out later this year, and I got to be honest, y'all, I'm a little nervous. Because Gladiator is like one of my all-time favorite movies ever made. And I don't know how they're going to make another one. Like, 20 years later, we're making Gladiator 2. I mean, I'm going to go see it as soon as it comes out, but I'm nervous, right? Second Crusade, they lose Jerusalem. So now what do we have to do? We got to let's get another crusade going. So the Third Crusade, they go to take it again, and they lose. They never recapture it, right? And then, so now what do we have to do? Well, if at first you don't succeed. Exactly, right? You know who said that? The little engine who could. And so they send the Fourth Crusade, and here's where it gets a little dicey. The Fourth Crusade never even made it to the Holy Land. They made it about halfway, and they attacked Constantinople, a Christian city. Never even made it to Jerusalem. They got halfway there and said, I don't feel like walking anymore. Let's just kick the crap out of these people and take what they have. Technically, there were 8 official crusades. There were a bunch of other smaller ones. There was one called the Children's Crusade, where a bunch of little French boys decided that they were going to go preach the gospel to the Muslims, and they all got sold into slavery. Well, the ones who lived, right, is not good. So are you noticing a little bit of a pattern from these crusades? Well, let me ask you this. Do you think the crusades were motivated by people wanting to expand the kingdom of God? Or do you think they were motivated by kings and rulers wanting money and land and power? Yeah, definitely number 2. Considering how in the fourth one they didn't even make it to the Holy Land and they attacked a Christian city, right? Yeah, all the 8 official crusades were all sent by the Pope. Now later ones, smaller crusades were just grassroots efforts. People were just let's get a crusade going. We haven't done one of those in a while. Who wants to walk 5,000 miles with me real quick, to go, fight some Muslims? None of them resulted in any salvations. None of the crusades resulted in the reclaiming of the Holy Land. None of it. It was just kind of, something that didn't really have much success, right? So, let's conclude with this tonight, okay? Let me see, are we in the right? Yeah, there we go. So let's talk about just what it was like being a Catholic in the Middle Ages, because that's going to lead into what we talk about next week, okay? During the Middle Ages, we have the rise of what are called monks. So when you think of a monk, I want you to just picture a medieval monk. I want you to picture Friar Tuck in your head, okay? Just get Friar Tuck in your head, and you are there, okay? Yeah, yes. That's the best Robin Hood movie, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner, where he doesn't even pretend to do a British accent, right? I've seen that movie so many times. What was it like to be a Catholic in the Middle Ages? This is Roman Catholic in the West, right? Well, after Constantine, we had these guys called the Desert Fathers. We talked about them last week. And they basically said, look, it's not illegal to be a Christian anymore, and it's just too easy. These Christians, they're going too soft. So you know what we got to do? We got to make it harder on ourselves. So they started doing things like going and living out in the middle of nowhere in the desert and not eating very much and living really strict lifestyles. This is called monastic living. You're a monk. You live at a monastery, right? And during the Middle Ages, we have the rise of monasticism. And the monks become the norm. Instead of just a handful of Christians going to live at monasteries, now all of a sudden it was if you wanted to be in ministry in any way, you had to be a monk. Most of this is based on a guy named St. Francis, the Franciscan monks. It sort of became the model that everyone followed. The way the Franciscan monks did it, it's how everybody did it. So they wore the little brown things with the little rope tied around the waist, and then they shaved the top of their head, just the top of their head. They left the rim there. That type of haircut actually has a name. It's called a tonsure. And the shaved head, was for better prayer reception, I guess. I don't know. No, it actually was You know how they say, like, in Scripture it says, like, don't cover your head during prayer, right? So they took that very literally, and not even hair covered their head because they were always praying. So they just shaved just the top, just that back part of their head, right? True story. And they would go live in these monasteries, think like friars and nuns, right? And this was the beginning of having priests who were single, unmarried, and celibate. Up until this point, you could be a priest, you could be a minister, you could lead and be married and have children, all from the Old Testament all the way until the Middle Ages. It was totally normal. But because the Franciscan monks didn't get married, now all of a sudden nobody did. So let me ask you this. Should ministers be single or unmarried or celibate? Do you think that, I mean, I got to be honest with you, I'm not getting rid of my wife. I like her pretty good. She's pretty awesome. Yeah, I do like her pretty good. She's one of the good ones. I did teach English, actually. That's the sad part. You're looking at a certified English teacher. So this is the thing. Many of you I know we have some former Catholics, people grew up Catholic. What's this about? Like the priest not getting married? Like, does anything in Scripture say that? Yeah, so the idea is like you can dedicate all your time full time to serving the church, serving the people. And that includes lots of opinions. Lots of people have a lot of really strong opinions. And I know this time of year, every 4 years, we get to hear everybody's opinion, right? You've probably heard lots of opinions in the last few weeks. Yeah, I'm ready for everyone's opinions to be quiet. But however, a lot of people raise their opinion to the level of Scripture. And they raise their opinion to the level of, like, sin. Like, if you don't agree with me about this, how can you call yourself a Christian? And some of those things are legitimate. And some of them are disputable. But a good rule of thumb is when Scripture is silent, we should be too. So let's read what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says, "Now as a concession, not as a command, I say this. I wish that all of you were like I myself am. But each one has his own gift from God, one of one kind, one of another. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for you to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." So Paul says, this is a concession, this is not a command. If you're single or if you're widowed, stay single. You can serve the Lord. But if you need to get married, get married. It says everyone serves God in different ways. There's just clearly no commandment about ministers or priests not being married. So what happened was, this became the norm. This became the standard. And it really affected the type of people who were going into the ministry. And anytime you have monastic influence, like people living as monks, it always, no matter what, even non-Christian monks, think like Buddhist monks or Shaolin monks or hippies, it always goes extreme. So by the time